Hello and welcome to Geekatplay Studio Tutorials. In previous tutorials, we'll look on some keyframe and camera options. So in this one, I want to explore a little bit more about the camera properties options and how they can affect us in animations. Okay, so right here, I created three spheres. And one thing what I want to show when we look in normal life on a middle sphere, our front and background sphere will be blurred. In a view to achieve this effect that we have in real world, we need to work with the focal length and with a blur of percent. But one thing what you want to do, you want to set your focal point. It's mean which is object we're actually focusing on. It's very hard sometimes say by the numbers, but by using the target, it's help us to orientate and position our focal point for our camera easy. So let's click on this. It's help us to select, this right here we have it far away our focal point. So we can actually take and drag a little bit closer. So we can actually reposition the focal point. And at this right now, I set my focal point on middle of this sphere. So let's right now to preview what we done. So if we render without setting any blur, and I want to actually switch to the final mode so I can preview better, view to screen, you'll notice all our spheres look sharp, even we have a focal point set on the middle one. So let's go right now increase blur, which is help us set depth of field, and I want to set a little bit large size so we can see better effect of this. And you can see we applied some blur to our object. Again, we need to work a little bit better on settings on a blur so it will be more real. But this is to display the point that our camera have a focal point set to the middle one. Also, we can have a focal point to track some other objects. So focal point is the middle of our camera, which is representing position of the center of the camera and also of depth of the field for our camera. Let's go ahead, switch blurring back to 0. Next, what we have options, it is lock the high ground. The reasons why I want to show this, because what's happening many times when you work with animations and you have it lock is enabled. So let me, for example, you have some camera move applied, and here I take my camera and I decide to move my camera ahead. So you notice the camera start jumping. In many cases, when you start work with animations camera over terrain and a height is enabled, you notice your camera start jumping and it doesn't have a very smooth kind of go to because your height is locked. Be sure your height is unlocked if you want a small kind of going camera or following something and you don't want any object below affecting you. But if you want a camera simulate maybe of the movements for the car or pedestrian who work over the some terrain, you probably do want enable height on this. Your camera will follow the terrain profile. So let's go ahead. Just overall, very fast mention, all options can be enabled, but we going to our animation tab. And right here, we have a few options I want to look at as we work with camera. The one in it you find everywhere, it's called forbid animations. All animations will be destroyed when you click on this button. So let's do a couple things right now. We have our main camera right here. We'll add keyframe. We'll move, okay, let's move our timeline, move our camera, move our timeline, and move camera one more time. So right now it's enable animations. If I click forbid animations, it's come the warning says everything will be destroyed. If you proceed, you notice right here, all your keyframe was erased. So the camera is not animated. In this case, anything that you apply to the camera won't be affected because camera will stay stationary as all properties. The same things forbid animation will apply to every object that you can select it and apply that options. It is useful in many cases when you don't want it. Um, some one object maybe affect to ecosystem population or other things. Other one, you can lock no animation on them as well. Again, if you press Control Z, it will restore it, but sometimes not all the way. So let's go ahead. Again, we destroy animation. And I like to use this option to destroy animations when I want to clear up everything, all keyframe that was maybe applied to this object. It's kind of very useful. It's like almost clear everything. In some cases, you will find out when you start working with animation and it seems like you delete keyframe, but your camera still remembers some properties because they kind of store internally in some other places. By applying this forbid any animation, you can erase totally everything. Okay, so next we have the properties, non-switchable cameras. Will help you this option to disable switch between multiple cameras. What's happening when you start render, you have options to add different type of cameras from position and different angles with different settings. And on timeline, you actually can animate which camera will take what animation at what point. And by enable this, you can actually set this camera as main and you cannot switch between of them. We'll look on these properties on multiple cameras rendering in one time and a little bit more advanced tutorials in the future. So let's go ahead. Next we have it pick the target object, and when we're going with track object, we saw that before we can just have it one object and we can camera follow this object, track the object. You have it actually for dynamic options, which is have it more advanced for this tracking. So instead we can say what object we want to track. For example, we want to track sphere 1. Okay, also we have it options now appearing of loose dynamics. Loose dynamics will give it this little bit delay in the camera movements based on our properties, which is follow the object. It's happening when, for example, you have a camera and the camera try to follow the object, but object sometimes moving faster, so camera maybe a little bit delay on beginning and kind of follow. This option will look in the end of our tutorials will create little bit animations where we're using the loose dynamics and you can see how it can work more in practice. Also, we can have it automatic or we can custom respond where we can say delay in milliseconds of camera following. So for example, when this object moving 2 units, maybe seconds or frames, we can tell when the camera start respond on this object movements, how much in a seconds one delay are also proportional, integral, and derivable options. Okay, so let's look what proportional. Proportional will help us set the reaction on difference based on the desired value and current value. Or another case, it will kind of determine how much error in our camera motions we can allow. Integral determine the reaction based on accumulations of the difference. When derivative is determines the reaction, the rate of change on the error. So another case you can specify how your camera will react on emotions, how much error in the motion of the camera. Those proportions very tricky to set up. The kind of very interesting effect you can achieve, and recommend to check the Wikipedia on the PID type respond specifically for the camera. So it's give it a little bit more explanation of how you can modify those options. If you don't want to play with all the settings, just use the uncheck custom response and just use a default that build inside the view, and you can see how your changing is applied, which is work actually quite a bit nice for our camera settings. Okay, link. It's a similar what we have at link before that we can link to specific object, and we can link also based on the position, rotation, size, and joint. So right here we have our camera. You also notice right here we have our response. that we can send without going inside target. Link, similar what we had before, where you can link one object to specific to other or a camera, same like we linked to the sphere in our previous tutorial. Next, we have an animation toolbox. By clicking on the okay, to clicking on animation toolbox, we actually need to have it first keyframe applied to our object. So let's go ahead, add to keyframe. Okay, now we have the ability to open our animation toolbox. And right here, how we said before, it is everything that we have it in animation wizard, only a bit more condensed and on one page. So when you know what they're doing, you can modify those settings. So let's do right now work a little bit more with the loose tracking and see how that can provide for us interesting effects. So let's go ahead first. I want to go ahead, delete all of those setting options. I will just leave it to one sphere here. Okay. Also, let's create some terrain on a background, which is help us to kind of have it something on a back so we know how our object going. Next, we'll take sphere. We'll add keyframe to our sphere. We'll move, okay, right here. Let's move a little bit, move our sphere slightly. Next, we'll move one more second and increase so it's higher distance. That will apply also a little bit acceleration. Slightly, we'll move right here. We also can just move higher up. Okay, apply one more time. And we'll just accelerating, putting our object away. So right now you notice our camera is tracking our object. The one what we want to do, it is be sure in our camera it set the perfect respawn, which is mean camera precisely following the object, or lose when we have more errors with our camera. The one thing sometimes it's preview on a camera acceleration doesn't represent accurate in our views because it should take in consideration the global settings, the best effect we can achieve when we start rendering. But it does help us to preview. You can see we lost our object because it's gone a little bit too fast. So let's reduce our settings a little bit closer to this. So right here, we're kind of following. Okay. And we're kind of ready to render to preview our small experiment with a loose camera. So let's go. Okay, we'll go ahead, 640. The one thing what I want to also use, I want to use actually broadcast quality for this. Reason why with broadcast quality, we have it motion blur will apply to object. And when we start working with kind of camera motion and with object, we want to have this camera blur, motion blur kind of. And I will look after we finish render, I kind of will look more on those options. Okay, and we're ready. Let's render our animation right now. Okay, it will take a little time to render, so I will pause our tutorial and we'll come back after animation finish render. Okay, so right here it's finished render, and you can see how we have it with camera. Camera, it's kind of almost try to catch up with our object. It's a little bit go delay. And again, this is animation. If you notice, it's different from what we kind of preview in our view window. So it's same what I said before. When you preview right here, it will be a little bit different from when you final render due to some global adjustments that apply effects on the camera. So be sure you run at least preview render for your animation to be sure your camera is following correctly your object as you want it. Like for example, right here you can see objects stay kind of in scenery almost all the time. And when we actually preview, you can see the object quite a bit of the camera. So obviously we kind of want to readjust. And again, if we set to the perfect, it's meaning no loose camera. And when we render, our camera will constantly keeping the object just in the middle of the screen all the time. This is kind of overview of the properties also and animations on the camera. They have more advanced settings on the our camera options, and we'll look on those in advanced animation camera settings tutorial. Thank you for watching this tutorial from Geekatplay Studio. Please remember visit us on the web is www.geekatplay.com.